Hello friends, time for a story. Sometimes we meet people who have dreams and others who think they're fools. This is a story about a dreamer. Dreamer Dave. Dave grew up in Northern Ireland in an Irish town some of you know so well. One of those sad places where all the Roman Catholics live at one end of the town and all the Protestants live at the other end. Well, Dave, by what he called just a birth lottery, was born a Protestant. At least that's what people would have claimed about him. A small boy, he'd attended July the 12th marches, and holding a cheap Union flag wondered what oranges, which he liked, had to do with men in bowler hats and pipes and drums. But as he grew up, he was sure that what was happening in the 1960s was much more important than what had gone on in the 1690s. And he had little interest in a battle between an English king and a Dutch one on Irish soil. In fact, the two kings being father-in-law and son-in-law seemed to make all his father's talk about family tradition seem very empty. Though the family tried to shape him, he thought for himself, and when influenced by the young hippie culture of the world, he decided that he was a pacifist. His feelings coincided though with things hotting up in the north of Ireland, and in his own life, trouble started as a result. Dave dreamed of a world where people loved each other. Skin colour, nationality, class, or the religion of one's birth would not divide people anymore. Despite church and political propaganda, he couldn't see that Roman Catholics were any different from him, nor how a black South African was inferior to a white one. Trouble was, he had pro-British, patriotic and somewhat bigoted parents, school teachers who were also British in mind and heart, and all the other teenagers in his housing estate were convinced that Catholics were different. Inferior, even. So they thought. Some were recruited into the fast-going Protestant paramilitary organisations, similar to those of the IRA in the Catholic community. These organisations that were around him were ruthless and intolerant. It seemed that those people who would sooner everyone died in a hail of bullets than be ruled from Dublin, papist rule his cousin John called it, these were the people who now seemed to have to be there to run the housing estate where Dreamer Dave lived. Yes, that was what they called him, Dreamer Dave. When he took work at a filling station owned by a Catholic family, it seemed to some he betrayed them. One boy a year older had shouted, "Dreamer Dave, you're a nightmare! Are you stupid? They work for us, we don't work for them." Riots, bullets, bombs were now common. Marches, strikes and protests too. Most people were drawn into at least political support for the side that supported them in their religious views. In the north of Ireland the two fit together like shoes and feet. Roman Catholics couldn't understand why the six counties were ruled by Britain, seeing it as the occupying force and longing to be part of a green 32-county Republic of Ireland. Protestants, on the other hand, didn't view themselves as Irish at all, but as Ulster and British. The clergy often fanned the flames, as did the politicians. Many Protestants wouldn't even cross the Irish border. Dave used to tell his mother he was surprised she breathed because the air blew in from the Republic. His mother really tried to see his point of view, but it was hard for her because it seemed she'd been born with a Union flag on her head, and though she'd like to see a world without violence, she couldn't see beyond that flag. His father, though, could hardly look at him and dismissed his views with a black look and a harsh tone of voice. One night, Dave was coming home from work and he noticed Andrew Mason and his four favourite bully boys standing on the narrow path behind the citizen houses. What Dave didn't know was that they'd been drinking, and as he approached they set about taunting him, pushing him, taunting him again, pushing him and demanding he sing the Sash, a Protestant song. Unafraid, Dave told them he would sing no loyalist songs, or Republican ones for that matter, but he would sing them a song, and he launched forth in good voice with a personal rendering of Bob Dylan's With God on Our Side. He got through a couple of lines and Mason punched him hard in the face. Soon the dreaming pacifist was on the ground and being punched by five young men who certainly had no time for his dreams. The kicks and punches landed everywhere and one of the boys had lifted a wooden pole. Dave could taste blood, couldn't see much, but he comforted himself with the thought that if they killed him he had at least stuck to his convictions. As he lay there, a still easy target, old Sergeant Marshall came running out of her house, brandishing her yard brush, and hit it out at them. And because her son was in prison for paramilitary activity on the Protestant side, Mason Feiler and the bully boys backed off. When Dave came round, he was in hospital, and as a pretty young nurse took his hand, he wondered if he'd gone to heaven. She told him she was Nurse OMalley, Mary OMalley. "You've taken a terrible beating, I'm afraid, David." He had indeed, with fractured ribs, cuts and bruises all over, his face swollen, fat lips, a broken nose, and his eyes sore and black. The worst, though, was the cut on his head caused by a blow with that wooden pole. He ached from his toes to his head, but as she smiled and said, "Try not to move too much and I'll find the doctor and tell him you're conscious," the effect of her voice on him was better than painkillers. They kept him in hospital for a week, and he told the police he would not give the names of his attackers. He saw no point. He'd only be all the more an enemy. One of the policemen who visited the hospital to question him was a cousin of Andrew Mason's, so he had little trust that justice would ever be done. Mary OMalley, the nurse, made his stay worthwhile, and when he asked her for a date she agreed despite her reservations. Her family of Roman Catholic persuasion were not going to like it much, but the two 21-year-olds were most certainly drawn together. A week later he picked her up in a bright red minicar that his boss had lent him, a bit old and battered, and they went to watch a movie in the next town. As they enjoyed a meal together, it was obvious to Dave that Mary wanted peace as much as he did. They never attended church, save for weddings and funerals. Sorry, wrong page. The romance blossomed, but of course both families were against it, though Mary's brother, 18-year-old John, was an ally. He said, being a Republican doesn't mean hating someone because he's a Protestant. Joe Wolfe-Tone himself was a Protestant. Mary and Dave walked miles together through woodland, along riverbanks, over mountains and on beaches. They visited towns all along the Irish border on both sides, but as they exercised their legs they also exercised their tongues, communicating in depth until they formed a pact. They would cease being of either religion, and would try and praise God by helping people, whoever they were. The registry office wedding was small. The legally required 2 witnesses came in the shape of his boss and her brother John. After the ceremony, the 4 of them had a meal in a hotel, and the boss gave them the Mini as a wedding present. They had a week in a cheap hotel in Portrush, and from there explored the north coast, and by the end of that week they had a love that was deeper than either of them could ever have considered possible. It would be impossible, though, to live in her village, so they rented a house near the edge of the town, away from both Protestant and Catholic ghettos. Sadly, they found they couldn't have children, and the religious prejudices and climate made it almost impossible for folk like them to foster children, though there was a great need for this. So they decided to use their lives encouraging peace and understanding and helping people if they could. The years of violence just made the dreams of real peace seem more essential. One night the house was petrol bombed, but they soon put the fire out. The police asked them if they had any idea who might have done this, and they both laughed. The families did improve in attitude a little, because they found respectively that they'd gained a son or a daughter who always wanted to help them in times of trouble. They never attended church, save for weddings and funerals, declining what they called the hypocritical talk of the very men in white collars who supported all the division and bigotry. Instead, they made it a Sunday habit to share time together amid the creation, genuinely feeling that God could be better found there than in a building. They increased in knowledge of living things, delighting in those wild things, and through the years their love grew like a clump of wild flowers. Mary said they had but one heart. There were bombs regularly, but the one nearby his boss's service station was too much, and the business was sold to a Protestant. So Dave, now in his 40s, was told his services would no longer be needed. It was a time of high unemployment, as bad in this town as anywhere in the European common market. Mary, who was by now a nursing sister, was busy, but Dave was one of the many unemployed. Usually he took a walk each morning around the loch near their home, enjoying the peace of the water and the changing seasons. The ducks and the geese were a joy to see. and on the winter mornings he would maybe break some ice off for them to have access to the water. As he walked down the path to the water, he could hear the voices of the children on vacation from school, and he was concerned to see some of them out on the ice. One little girl with her dog right out near the island. They just couldn't resist the temptation of fun on the ice, and didn't understand how dangerous it was. The cool wind caused him to raise his collar and put his cap down. He was about 50 yards from the lake when he heard the children scream and shout. The little girl and the dog had gone down through the ice. Hurling his coat to one side and taking off his boots in haste, he ran onto the ice and was soon feeling the coldest he ever had as his body hit the water. Diving, he found the child and dragged her back through the water and ice to the shore. He wrapped her in his coat and used what Mary had taught him to help the child breathe. "Benji, my dog," she cried. Shouting for a child with a bicycle to go to a house and phone for an ambulance, he turned and went back for the dog. The coroner said that this brave man seemed to have become trapped under the ice and could not find his way out. He told Dave's wife and family that he hoped that through time they would find comfort in the fact that he had saved a little girl's young life before losing his own. Poor Mary had been told at the hospital and had wept as only the most grief-stricken can. She was popular at the hospital, and it seemed everyone from the surgeons to the cleaners joined her in mourning. At a home for the wake, both families united as never before, and Protestant and Catholic clergy happened to call at the same time. Nobody argued successfully with her demand that he wanted no clergyman preaching at his funeral. It took place at Roselawn Crematorium in Belfast, and those Mary asked to take part gladly did. His old boss sang the favourite Dylan song of his, "With God on Our Side." A doctor from the hospital agreed to read one of David's favourite poems by Robert Frost, "The Road Not Taken." Mary's brother talked about his best friend and how Dave and Mary had shown that Protestant and Catholic can be united in peace. The matron from the hospital had spoken of this gentle young man with beautiful dreams who saved a young girl's life and given his own trying to save her dog. Mary, at the end, had mustered up her courage and prayed out loud, concluding her prayer by saying that she hoped God would help the people here gathered to see Dave as a symbol of hope and peace, because then his death would have some value besides the little girl's life. People offered her comfort, and her father stunned her by telling her that she had been married to the best man in all of Ireland. Her mother-in-law hugged her and told her she loved her as a daughter, and her own mother told her that Dave had inspired her. Mary determined in her heart to hold on to her husband's dreams, and she did. At the back of the crematorium, a big man hugged his little girl as she sobbed loudly, partly for Benji and partly for Dave. But the father was crying too, rocking her back and forth with tears streaming down his face. He cried for Dave too, but also for himself. Holding his daughter close, he seemed to be hurting much more than was normal. His name was Andrew Mason.